I half jokingly tell all my colleagues, like, ask ChatGPT before you ask me, because ChatGPT is a lot smarter than me. And only ask me if you still can't figure it out with the AI tools you use. But that's quite different to how most people learn. Most of us are actually lazy learners. We're not in the 5% hyper proactive learners. You can also be a very proactive learner for some topics, but not for others. I'm constantly learning about the space that I'm in.
Welcome to Brave. Learn from Southeast Asia's best tech leaders. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. No BS on success. I'm Jeremy Au, venture capitalist, serial founder, Harvard MBA, science fiction nerd, and dad of 2 daughters. Every week, we debate startup news, interview changemakers, answer listener questions, and share personal insights. Join our movement of over 40,000 members and get transcripts, resources, and community at www.bravesea.com. Stay well and stay brave.
Hey, Henry, good to see you.
Hey, Jeremy. Good to see you too. Thanks for having me.
It's good to have a sequel episode in person after our last thing that we did remote, online, whatever that was, 2 years ago.
Exactly, yeah.
Why are you in Singapore?
I'm here for 2 things. There's an Endeavor event and a Founders Forum. Thankfully, the 2 are around the same time. Thought I'd pop in.
Yeah, very good. I think what's interesting is that since it's been 2 years since the last episode, we're thinking about how has the business changed in terms of the macro environment, your strategy, approach, how you yourself has changed as a leader and person as well. Could you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Henry Motte-de la Motte. I'm the CEO and founder of Edge Tutor.
Fantastic. I think we did invest in you. So there's that
Thank you.
angle. I'm happy to see the progress you're making. I guess the first question I have is, how has your company changed over the past 2 years since we wrote that check? AI has become a huge thing. I'm curious, how would you think about it?
Yeah, so I think there's kind of like 3 things that have changed. It used to be the elephant in the room, now it's just the elephant in the park, but AI is absolutely everywhere. I think we've always taken the contrarian view, which many in the education industry are taking, by the way, that an important role to be played by human educators. I think what AI will do is it'll accelerate the divergence between those who can afford a human educator and those who have to rely on more automated or software-based solutions. Which is, not necessarily a great thing, but there's still a massive role to be played by human educators. I think what's interesting is that's been borne out in our data. Our business model is tutor outsourcing. So we have tutors based in Asia, and we staff them with tutoring and education companies around the world. Those companies have been implementing AI into their operations. They are competing with AI-only solutions. The feedback we're getting from clients is those who can afford it want a human component, but they'll want that 1 hour of English, that 1 hour of math every week. Then, the rest of the week I can do all sorts of other things, but they still want that human regular touch point. And that's where we come in. We provide the teachers for that regular touch point. The macro picture has changed in so many of our end markets. When I last spoke to you, I think we maybe operated in half a dozen countries. We're now in 30 countries around the world, including all the large economies. In North America, South America, Middle East, and Asia Pacific. We've seen different trends in every market. China famously had a double reduction act that kind of depressed demands in some part of the EdTech sector. The government hasn't changed the regulation, but it's become more relaxed around it. People in mainland China place a lot of emphasis on education, and that never went away. In Europe, you've had some reforms. For example, in the UK, there's been some tax reforms which are actually increasing tutoring demand post-COVID, the private sector. And the US is going through its whole thing between the end of tutoring subsidies, which were COVID related, to a lot of changes being initiated by the new administration. And what's been interesting for us is because we're multi-country, we're exposed to all of these macro shifts, but less reliant on any single market. That's part of our strategy as well. You just want to diversify. The third thing I would say is that when we last spoke, we have been very much English focused. We kept looking at the market, and 80% of spend is on English and math. So it made sense for us to go into math. We've been disciplined about not entering other subjects, even when we're asked to. We're focusing on the 80, and the 80 is English and math. So that's what we're teaching in 30 countries.
Yeah. So obviously a lot of macro changes, and fantastic to see, I think, the company adapt there. I think what's interesting is unpacking each of these pillars, right? First of all is the AI one. I have to say that I'm learning a lot from AI, right? If I don't understand something about biology, something to do with some sort of like RNA and some like technical component. I've been using AI to explain stuff and then also explain it at different levels of complexity. Use both an historical lens, which is useful for me to understand history, but also the metaphorical side to simplify it. As an adult learner, I'm curious from your perspective, why is it that AI, this approach doesn't really work for K-12 the way that you're describing?
So that's the funny thing. It does work. There's basically three elements. AI works best, like every single new tool in education, right? Going back to encyclopedias, tapes, the basic internet, and 2.0. It's always down to the type of learner. One of the big issues we have in the tech world is we're always building for the 5%, which I mean, you're a classic in a way. You strike me as a classic 5% learner, very self-motivated, very educated, already always did well academically, very curious. But it's really the self-motivation and the self-discipline that makes you the ideal use case. Most of my team, we use AI in our operations. We use it in teacher recruiting, we use it in teacher training. I half jokingly tell all my colleagues, like, ask ChatGPT before you ask me, because ChatGPT is a lot smarter than me. And, only ask me if you still can't figure it out with the AI tools you use. But that's quite different to how most people learn. Most of us are actually lazy learners. We're not in the 5% hyper proactive learners. You can also be a very proactive learner for some topics, but not for others. I'm constantly learning about the space that I'm in. I used to speak Spanish, and I've been trying to learn it again for the last 3 years. I've signed up to a bunch of high quality software solutions. I'm not learning Spanish because I'm just not motivated enough. That's the first thing. It brings in that element of accountability, that element of motivation. And I know that the day I really want to speak Spanish, I will sign up for Spanish classes with a human tutor. When I do that, I'll probably get the discipline to start doing homework, and then all the tools become helpful. What's fascinating is some of the clients we're starting to get now are companies that didn't start out with tutors. They were software only solutions. They realized that for 5, maybe 10% of learners, that's enough. But for 90%, they lack that motivation. They need the guidance. They need a human to be coaching them throughout the learning journey. It's thinking about your relationship to learning rather than the pure knowledge. If you're a motivated learner, the technology has been around for a very long time. My mother is from the Philippines. She speaks French better than my father, who's French. She is a language nerd. She locked herself up in the University of Geneva and for 9 weeks went through every single self-teaching material they had for French, and now beats all of my French relatives at Scrabble and speaks without an accent. This is pre-AI, many decades ago. Are you an extremely motivated learner? That's what we're seeing. And that's why we're seeing growth in the K-12 segment where we operate, but also in the adult segment. We're teaching English to executives in Mexico, Brazil, Spain, and China. These are all adults like you who have, they're already highly educated. They're already quite successful in their career. There's nothing stopping them with an AI tutor. It's not a cost issue. It's not an access issue. And yet they're still signing up for half an hour, 1 hour, 2 hours a week with someone in the Philippines. And that's what I find fascinating.
Yeah. Well, that's what my mom always used to say. If you fall in love with somebody, that's the fastest way to learn English. And I was like, Mom, are you saying to learn Chinese more? Yeah. And that's the interesting part, right? Because motivation is such a key thing. Some people are motivated to learn English, some people are motivated to learn math. But the awkward reality is most people are only learning English because they have to, or they have to learn math because it's part of the curriculum.
Yeah, well, I push back a little bit. Math, definitely because it's on the curriculum. The people who enjoy math are a minority. English, actually, what's quite endearing is even if you're studying it for academic or professional purposes, because it's the global language, there are a lot of positive benefits of learning English. Like you can understand your Taylor Swift songs better, you can watch more Netflix, you can more easily travel. When it comes to learning English, there's a lot of joy for the learners because it's better for you academically, professionally, socially, travel-wise. It is the global language.
Let them watch Monty Python.
It just opens up like so many things in terms of travel, professional opportunities, studying abroad. And we find that the pleasure levels are quite high. And as a result, people enjoy just interacting with a human.
I think a contrarian or maybe an AI optimist would say, well, okay, maybe not for math because nobody wants to study math, but English, as an example. This AI is going to be happy to talk to you in English through chat. And then now we're layering on voice as well.
A very realistic video avatar.
And I think there's this case to say, if you can FaceTime or do a Zoom call with a remote English teacher, you can do it 100 times cheaper
Sure.
using a video AI avatar. How would you react to that statement?
There's a couple of things. Ironically, it can work really well with certain personality types. There's some AI tutors that do very well in parts of Northeast Asia, where some learners are so shy that they don't even want to practice with another human.
Right.
And so there's some companies that are doing quite well there. So that's the first thing. There's a bit of a personality element. The same way, for example, I have aspirations to sing better. It's possibly never going to happen. I'm not comfortable taking singing lessons, but I have downloaded some AI-powered singing apps, and I'll happily sing off key to my phone. So I think a lot of people have this with accent. What holds us back when we're learning a language is the fear of sounding stupid with our accents. It's what's holding me back from practicing my Spanish. I have the grammar and the vocab. I'm not very comfortable with my accent. An AI tutor can do incredibly well. I think you have to go back to what are you trying to pick up? There is a point where the technology is so advanced that the AI tutor will behave like another human. The exchanges you're having with the AI tutor are the same as those with a human. We might get to a point, and in some instances already are at that point, but instinctively, humans are very imperfect in the way we think, the way we reason, the way we pronounce. If you're practicing, the reality is that's what you need, because the English you want to speak is not to speak to an avatar that speaks perfect English. It's to be able to speak in English when you're traveling. It's to be able to speak in English when you're doing business. So you want to have essentially human experience to know how to deal with other humans. You're not just learning the language, it's also, it's social, it's emotional learning too. Where I'm more bullish on a human is, if you're trying to learn how to relate to other humans, a human is probably the best way to get that.
Yeah.
The third one is actually really interesting and will depend on how we relate to machines. One of the most important things with tutoring specifically is the accountability element. You prepay for a service at a set time and you have to show up on that time. I have this with personal training, where if I go to the gym by myself, I'll cancel gym sessions. If I've paid for a personal trainer, I've got this sense of obligation and I will want to show up. It's the same thing with tutors. The reason I don't speak Spanish is I've already paid for all the apps. I've already paid for all the services. In theory, I could learn Spanish at any point of the day or night. And in practice, I just don't. When you have a teacher once a week, you have to show up. Will we ever get to a point where people will pay for a session with a tutor and treat the machine the way they would treat a human?
Yes, probably.
That's interesting, right? If you think about human behavior with apps right now, there's many apps where people sign up for the whole month. They're paying for the app. They have no sense of urgency of using it, so they don't use it. I've spent on so many meditation apps. Every year I renew, telling myself I'm going to meditate every day and be a better person. I don't do it because there's no human. The 3 times I've had meditation sessions with humans, I was there on time, I showed up and I participated. Maybe it's a generational thing. Do people show up for software? Let's say you sign up for a 3 p.m. session. The problem with software is that it's an infinite resource. So there's all these things we should all be doing. All of us should be doing breath work in the morning, but most of us don't. When there's something that's good for you that you should do, but where there's no sense of urgency, most of us revert to just not doing it. This is why people have a weekly personal trainer. This is why people have a weekly English lesson. It's because Tuesday 3 p.m. doesn't really matter if you've paid for it and you have to show up. That accountability is massive. If you paid for an AI tutor, would you accept that you're only allowed to use it for that one slot at 3 p.m. on a Tuesday? When you know there's no limitation, what would make you agree that you're only allowed to practice at 3 p.m.? If they say you can practice whenever you want, when it's available all the time, people use it none of the time. We've seen this with human tutors, services in the US that were selling into schools, and they were saying 24/7 tutoring available. Kids can use it anytime, any day. The stats are that usage was around low single-digit %.
Okay. What's interesting is that obviously we're talking about these trends. One interesting aspect is demographics, right?
Yeah.
The birth rate in these developed countries are low, right? Singapore's at 0.9, Korea is also around 0.9, but Seoul itself is 0.4. Europe is also around 0.9 as well.
Yeah.
I mean, if you probably split out, like recent immigrants would be higher birth rate and local citizens are probably lower, right? So this kind of interesting from an education perspective compared to spending on economic security, housing, or travel experiences. I mean, there's so many different reasons.
Correct. People don't have children automatically. It becomes a conscious choice. When it's a conscious choice, people factor in budget, lifestyle, personal obligations, a career, and all these things. The reality is very often having a kid in your 20s is disruptive.
In some countries, people could look at it as to have a kid is going to cost me $500,000, maybe $1 million, depending on
what your aspirations are where you live.
And we saw that in China where people were like, okay, is that I have one child and concentrate all resources from both sides of the family to give them the best start in life rather than three kids. And what's interesting is that nobody has figured out how to get that birth rate up. Even France has a little bit of a bump, but that's very small. So I'm just kind of curious because it seems like from an education perspective, it feels like to me, demographically, it feels like birth rates are going down. So spend per child is going up. I'm just curious how you see that, because it feels like one aspect I was talking to this education founder and his perspective was becoming more premiumized as a result of this. And I was thinking through the implications of that statement.
I think I spend a bit too much time in education conferences, but it's something I really enjoy. I meet up with clients, I meet up with advisors, and I get to hear all sorts of different models being developed around the world. If you think about it, for the last century or so, if you were wealthy, you still learned in a group environment, right? You might have gone to a very elite private school. What we're now seeing is a lot of interesting models around going back to the model of the last few centuries, which was the most elite form of education is one-on-one or a very small group. There's a very interesting school in the US called Fusion. You have your 1 hour of math class one-on-one and 1 hour of physics and you have 1 hour English. And there's still group activities and ways of socializing. But if you think about the very premium experience, a child can learn, and there's different schools of thought. Some people say the whole point of school is to socialize. One-on-one is not that great from a social development perspective. What we're moving towards is more premium education. One of the ways you go premium is you constantly reduce the ratio of learners to teachers. It's fascinating to see. AI allows you to personalize. Those who can afford it will have the highest human element because those with the means have essentially AI-enabled human teachers. So you get the human element. There's also a trust element. You know, what's so interesting is a lot of the guys in Silicon Valley, you ask them how they raise their kids, no screen time. Make it make sense. It's classic NIMBYism, right? They're all for social equality, but please not in my backyard. No social housing behind me. You have entire school systems trying to reduce the use of technology. Sweden has gone back to pen and paper because they've proven that you learn more when using pen and paper than digital devices. But again, it's an income thing. Are we going to see in low or mid-income countries one-on-one AI-powered tutors? No. You're going to have a group class of 15, 20, 30 people. There's going to be a software solution where we can't afford human tutoring, but here's a very high-quality AI tutor. Go play with Conmigo and you can learn. In fact, they'll probably learn faster because they're so sharp, they can just keep going back and forth with the AI tutor. What worries me is what happens to the other 95%. And I think that's the angle that we're trying to play. Our teachers are from a lower income country when we supply our teachers into the US, into Europe, into the Middle East. And my hope is that we can make human-centric education more affordable in mid and high-income countries. I don't have an answer for low-income countries, including the Philippines.
I think that's the crux of the issue. Education is a function of how much money you put into it at some level, right?
Absolutely.
You know, and then obviously a teacher costs money, all right? And that's pegged to your GDP per capita or and your cost of living in every country. I was just looking at San Francisco and, you know, what's interesting, I was looking at it was that, you know, obviously there's a public system where it's free, but it takes a ballot to get in. For parents who are not happy with where the ballot is, they'll go to a private school and pay 40,000 US a year.
You're paying $500,000 for K-12.
So you're paying for effectively 13 years back to back. That's about $500,000.
Adjust for inflation plus college, you're at $1 million.
Yeah, education is not unless you go to a state university, and even so, that's still quite a chunk. So probably up to $1 million of cost. If you're an American, I'll be like, wait a moment. Why am I going to have that additional kid?
And also,
who has $1 million? And of course, parents obviously are thinking to themselves, okay, I'm not with a tier 2, tier 3 school if the ballot gave me a tier 2, tier 3. I mean, every parent wants the best for their kid, right?
Correct.
So I think there's just a little bit of that cost.
And tension. There's that massive tension, right? And so it's interesting because, you know, when you were saying, what is it going to take to reverse the falling birth rates? It's not going into a version of The Handmaid's Tale where you force everyone to have kids, but it probably goes through massively lowering the cost of having kids.
Yeah.
The reason the birth rates are falling is that the distribution of children is roughly the same. If you look at the population, Before, maybe 75% were having kids, X% were having one kid, X% were having two, X% were having three, X% were having four. That bell curve has not changed as much as you think. The biggest issue is that a lot of people are just completely opting out of having kids, massively compressing that bell curve. And you just have, as a whole, just a lot less kids being born in society. And, I go back to Singapore. So I did econ history as my major for undergrad. I loved when we studied Southeast Asia, the Asian tigers rising through the 70s, 80s, and 90s. The conventional theory is like, oh, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, the reason they did so well was because these were like export-led, hyper-capitalist societies. And actually, the thing they were teaching us in my slightly left-leaning university in London was, well, they also had fantastic institutions, and they massively invested in public housing and in public K-12 education. They didn't try to build the Stanford of Singapore, but it was give people super good quality, subsidized social housing, which would probably have a bigger dent on child rearing in Europe and in the US. If suddenly housing costs go down dramatically, people can just physically have the space to have kids.
Right.
And the school locations will be a lot less expensive, and the salaries of those who operate the school, which are a direct function of the cost of living, would also go down. So you thought we were going to talk about education and AI, and the solution is actually low-cost housing.
It's true. When we talk about education, we're talking about parents as customers and the state that is supporting these parents. And we're also talking about the people who are benefiting from this, which would be the children, right? The truth is that less and less children every generation, and parents are feeling more and more insecure about their economic future, about having kids. So I think it's all tied together. I was reading a Reddit thread, and the simple thread was like, are you going to have kids or not? And then maybe a quarter was like, the world is going to end because of climate change. So why am I raising this? I think it comes across as sad because as a parent, I love my children. Instead of resigning to never having kids, what do we need to change society and take action so that people feel comfortable? I totally understand it. The system feels huge. The climate change problem seems unsolvable. So I think feeling helpless.
It's a rational reaction.
Yeah, it's a rational reaction. From us who are passionate about education and reforming the system, hopefully we can take some action. Let's talk about those actions. In America, it's $1 million to raise a kid. Obviously, people may argue whether it's $500,000, but nobody's arguing it's around the range.
Everyone agrees that it's overpriced.
Do you think, hypothetically, the price of education dropped by a factor of 10 and everything else dropped by a factor of 10, do you think that would raise birth rates? And by how much? Or do you think it also wouldn't really solve the problem?
I think I'm really speaking with third-hand information, but it's, every complex problem, complex solutions, and so it's never going to be a silver bullet. I think it would be a step in the right direction. Another big one, which is kind of like education/social care, is all around childcare, right? We talk about birth rates in Europe, but actually Europe is a tale of different countries. There are countries that have childcare. Why does France have a higher birth rate than Germany? One of the key reasons is because in Germany is very inadequate.
Yeah.
And childcare in France is like a nursery as early as 3 or 4 months. It makes a massive impact, right? Otherwise, all the burden falls on the woman and she has to sacrifice her career, etc. It's fascinating because the birth rates are falling, which ties into immigration policy. What's so interesting is, again, I go back to Europe. You've got strong anti-immigration sentiment fueling some parties in Germany, France, and the UK. And what's fascinating is the Spanish example. Not everyone is in favor of it, but it resonated with voters to a point where the current parties in power basically said, look, we have two choices as Spain. Getting older and we're not having enough kids, so we just become an old society that can't afford our social security system, or we let in immigrants, ideally younger ones. This means larger workforce, more children being born, and the social system can continue. They've opted for route number 2. Spain has a very friendly policy for different types of immigrants, but it's quite open to immigration.
I was talking to this person who was very much in the IVF space. He was just saying, like, so much of the developed world's problems, political problems, actually boils down to a looming demographic crisis. All the policymakers understand that at some level, the economics of society, social security, and welfare doesn't work unless there's a certain component. This is now showing up as the debate between education for all, like immigration policy, and the demographic side. I think it was interesting because this is the real, and then everything else is a layer on top of it, which is taxation. You raise taxes, you do this or that. As a society, being people, we want people to assimilate and integrate into our society rather than our society, right? And I think that's super fair.
But also, I come from 2 very multicultural societies. The Philippines is a melting pot of Malay, Chinese, Spanish, American cultures. It makes for an interesting culture. People think of French culture as being very strong, but France is actually the result of the influences over time. It had a lot of waves of immigration. Sometimes it was Caucasian, and you don't physically notice it as much as some of the non-Caucasian immigrants. I'm also the product of immigration. I think immigration does solve things. Now, the problem is if you don't do it in a way that's fundamentally, then you get a lot of issues. And it's funny because earlier you asked me if there's anything I didn't want to talk about, and I said politics. So I'm going to try to not get too political here, but if you have the system for the many, then you're not fixing the problem. I think that's true with immigration, it's true with healthcare, it's true with housing. And it's true with education, which is why I always temper a little bit the enthusiasm around AI. And I'll give you an example. I was just in the US a couple of weeks ago at this big conference. Fantastic, super interesting speakers, lots of folks. And there was someone there that was reminding me that for all this talk about AI tutors and LMSs and all these things, the number one issue that some of the school districts that she's advising is attendance. Kids are not showing up to school. And if they're showing up, they haven't eaten or they have problems at home. And so she was like, you can throw as much AI as you want. If you have 20% of kids missing from the classroom, you're going to need more than a piece of software to solve that. And I think this is something we see over and over again in education, right? So every tool you build will improve educational outcomes based on digital access, based on their own level of literacy, based on their level of intrinsic motivation, etc. But you always have to go back to how are we improving education outcome for the many, not just a few.
I love what you just shared. I think it's a good reminder that the sexy conversation is AI, but it's going to take a while for it to trickle down the income pyramid. I think it really goes back into society about what we need to do to invest in that. So on that note, I'd love to summarize the 3 big takeaways. First of all, thanks for sharing about how you think about AI and what it means for education and whether kids will absorb AI education or not and the different approaches people are having. Many thanks for sharing how Edge Tutor has been changing its business model and adapting for that future, thinking through what it takes for great education, great teaching, and for a great experience for students. Lastly, thanks for talking about the societal aspect of it. Even though we're talking about technology, there's so much that policymakers and societies need to do to really allow that children not only have the AI schools and the budgets, we need to be thoughtful about what it means for parents to make that choice in terms of the cost of living and education needed for them to feel comfortable having kids. Otherwise, the end state is going to become so premium that in 100 years, there'll be only one child. Correct. We spend $1 trillion on that one child.
The pressure on that child.
Thank you so much for sharing. And
thanks a lot, Jack. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this episode, please share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. We would also appreciate you leaving a rating or review. Head over to www.bravesea.com for member content, resources, and community. Stay well and stay brave.